Hi, so in this video the main question I'd like to try to answer is this: is the Quran the word of God? And I'm going to start by first thinking about what kind of standard of proof would be acceptable to determine whether a book requires a supernatural explanation or not, and then I'm going to see if the Quran passes that test. So I'll be looking mainly at four areas: the scientific evidence, the prophetic evidence, mathematical codes, and the claim that the Quran itself is miraculous. And I'm going to try to do this with as many hard facts and statistics and solid arguments as possible, and as little speculation as possible. And I'm going to try to back up everything I say with sources that I'll link to below. There's a second video I've made which looks at a second question, which is: should we be worried about Islam? You may or may not know that Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world, and over the next few decades Islam will likely surpass Christianity as the world's dominant religion. So odds are you're probably going to come into contact with Islam a lot more often in the future. So it makes sense to question what kind of influence Islam is going to bring to the world and how it's going to affect your life. Will it be positive or will it be negative? But first I'd just like to make some brief introductory remarks. There are 1.6 billion Muslims in the world. That's 1.6 billion human beings. I want to make the world a better place. I don't want to contribute to making it worse, so I'm not here to disrespect or demonise a whole community of people. I'm here because I love the truth, I love good ideas, because they make people's lives better. And I've been studying Islam for a while now, and when I look at the Quran, I don't see truth. I don't think the Quran is the word of God. I don't think the evidence is strong enough at all. And I'll go through all of that shortly. I also see a lot of bad ideas in the Quran, ideas about the nature of God and his relationship to us, and ideas about women and hell that I believe are harmful and destructive. And so my hope is that any Muslims watching this video will listen open-mindedly to the arguments and reasons I'm going to present, and hopefully I can convince you that there are better ideas out there, supported by stronger evidence, that you're missing out on. There are better, more freer, more joyful ways of doing life. And for non-Muslims, I think it's important that we're informed about Islam, considering it's most likely going to be a growing influence in our lives over the coming decades. And one final thing to add is that, for the sake of transparency, I'm kind of a Christian, though I'm probably not like most Christians. I'm very independently minded and have always been a naturally skeptical person. I consider myself a truth seeker first and foremost, but so far the evidence has led me to Christianity. Which is perhaps a video for another day, but this video may have a Christian thread running through it, but that thread will also come with a huge dollop of humility in the face of claims to knowing the truth about the nature of God and the universe. I really don't know much for sure. I'm just a guy who's trying to examine the evidence to see where it leads. So with that said, I'll begin with the question: is the Quran the word of God? So first we need to figure out what criteria would we need to determine if a book is from God or not. And I propose that there are two groups of criteria. There's natural criteria and there's supernatural criteria. The supernatural criteria are things in the book that cannot be explained by natural causes only, and therefore require a supernatural explanation. And so I'll be looking at four main areas: scientific foreknowledge, prophecy, mathematical codes, and the perfection of the Quran itself. Now, with prophecy and scientific foreknowledge, I think if a book really does consistently and accurately reveal knowledge that there's no way the authors could have known without divine assistance, at some point the odds are going to switch in favour of a supernatural explanation. So these are two areas that could potentially convince you that a book has a supernatural origin. Mathematical codes potentially could be a good source of evidence as well, but only if the maths is done properly and the patterns go far beyond what would statistically be expected by chance. And as for the claim that the Quran itself is proof of the supernatural, I've coloured this in red because I actually wouldn't have included this under the supernatural criteria section myself. I'd have put it in the natural criteria section. But I've put it here because this is the main argument that most Muslims give as evidence that their book is from God, and it's the argument that the Quran itself gives. Muslims believe that the Quran is perfect, that it's absolutely free from error, it's inimitable, and it's so beautiful that it stands alone as evidence of God. So I want to respect their belief and examine the argument as they would want me to, as though it is evidence of the supernatural. So that's the supernatural criteria. As for natural criteria, I propose there are two main areas. Firstly, I think you need to look to see if the book aligns itself with reality. And by this I mean right across the board. So historically, does the book contain myths or biased interpretations of the past, or does it provide a trustworthy historical record? Morally, are there teachings in the book that go against our intuitions? Scientifically, does the book make scientific claims that match our current understandings? You could also look at the metaphysics of a book, but I don't really know enough about metaphysical reality to be able to tell whether a book aligns to it or not. But obviously, none of this is an exact science, because if God is superior to us, then we would expect to find certain aspects in the book that are beyond our understanding. But this is all just about building up a body of evidence. And the second natural criteria is the absence of contradiction. Although grammatical errors, I don't think necessarily have to count against God, because maybe God could work through human beings and their weaknesses. But if the book explicitly claimed it didn't contain any errors, which the Quran does, then grammatical errors would obviously be a problem. The bigger concern is doctrinal contradiction. If there were doctrinal contradictions in the book, then that's something that would make the book look more human than divine. But as I said earlier, this is where I personally would put the Quran's claim under the natural criteria heading, because creating a book that contains no contradictions is not a feat that is beyond human capacity to achieve. Neither would a book that aligns accurately with reality necessarily be a feat that is beyond human capacity to achieve. And this underlines the difference between the two sets of criteria. If all the natural criteria are met, but no supernatural criteria are met, then what you have is just a very good human book with nothing supernatural about it. Whereas, if the supernatural criteria are met, but none of the natural criteria are, then you would have a supernatural book on your hands, but it would be at best a complete mystery, and at worst evil and untrustworthy. So the supernatural criteria are what's important for testing whether a book is divine or not, but the natural criteria certainly would help your case if they're met, but they're not vital. And that's basically how I think we should approach a religious book like the Quran to see if it's truly from God or not. So let's see if the Quran passes the test. So let's begin with the scientific evidence. Throughout the Quran, various scientific statements are made which Muslims claim are not only accurate, but many of the statements couldn't have been known at the time of writing, and therefore are proof of God. So I'm going to start with the best arguments that Muslims offer, then work my way down. So the most common passage I've come across is the one about the human embryological sequence in Surah 23 verses 12 to 14, which reads, "And certainly we create man from an extract of clay, then we placed him as a sperm drop in a firm lodging, then we made the sperm drop into a clinging clot, and we made the clot into a lump of flesh, and we made from the lump bones, and we covered the bones with flesh, then we developed him into another creation." So Muslims will claim that this is a correct representation of the human embryological sequence, and that there is no way that a desert nomad from the 7th century could have known this, and therefore it is evidence of God. But there are two problems with this. Firstly, there has actually been quite a lot of embryological thought prior to the 7th century around the world. There are embryological ideas found in Hindu texts and the Talmud, and there's a very detailed history of it in Greek thought, starting with Hippocrates and Aristotle in the 4th century BC, and then further developed by Galen in the 2nd century AD. A good example can be found in the Bhagavata Purana, which is a Hindu text written around about the same time as the Quran. In Canto 3, chapter 31, verses 1 to 4, it reads, "The Supreme Lord said, because of its karma, the living entity as ordained by God through the particle of semen of a man enters the womb of a woman in order to dwell there for obtaining a body. On the first night the sperm and ovum mix. At the 5th night there is a bubble, and in about 10 days it is thereafter like a plump lump of flesh or an egg. Within a month a head appears, and within 2 months limbs like arms and feet form, the nails, the beginnings of hair, bones, skin, reproductive organs, and the apertures appear within 3 months. In about 4 months the 7 ingredients separate, body fluids and other elements. In 5 months feelings like hunger and thirst occur, and in 6 months the fetus starts to move around at the right in the amnion. So here we can see a far more detailed embryological account from a text written around about the same time, showing that it's not unthinkable that detailed embryological thought would have been known at this time in history. Now, the Greek thinkers had written entire books on the subject long before the Quran was written, and here are some quotes. In Galen's 2nd century work on semen, he writes, "Let us divide the creation of the fetus overall into 4 periods of time. The first is that in which the form of the semen prevails, but when it has been filled with blood and heart, brain and liver are still unarticulated and unshaped, yet have by now a certain solidarity and considerable size. This is the second period. The substance of the fetus has the form of flesh and no longer the form of semen. The third period follows on this, when it is possible to see the 3 ruling parts clearly and a kind of outline, a silhouette, as it were, of all the other parts. The fourth and final period, is at the stage when all the parts in the limbs have been differentiated." And later, in more detail, he writes, "The time has come for nature to articulate the organs precisely and to bring all the parts to completion. Thus it caused flesh to grow on and around all the bones, and at the same time it made at the ends of the bones ligaments that bind them to each other, and along the entire length it placed around them on all sides thin membranes called periostele, on which it caused flesh to grow." And similarly, 6 centuries before Galen, Aristotle in his work on the parts of animals in part 9 book 2 writes, "Round about the bones and attached to them by thin fibrous bands grow the fleshy parts, for just as an artist, when he is moulding an animal out of clay, takes first some solid body as a basis, and round this moulds the clay, so also has nature acted in fashioning the animal body out of flesh." So we can clearly see that a lot of detailed embryological thought had been known for a long time before the Quran. So there's nothing unique or surprising about the Quran's account. It doesn't require divine explanation. But the second problem is that the Quran's account is actually wrong. Bones do not form first and then become covered in flesh. They actually form kind of simultaneously, and if anything, it's the muscles that form first, before the bones. According to the Medical Encyclopedia from the US National Library of Medicine, under fetal development, it states that it's not until weeks 31 to 34 that the baby's bones are fully developed, and even at this stage they're still soft, while 16 weeks before that, in weeks 15 to 18, the baby is already said to have transparent-like skin, and even before this, arms and legs have already begun to grow, the face is well formed, the baby has fingernails and tooth buds, and all essential organs have begun to grow by week 9. So this idea that the bones form first and then are covered in flesh is clearly an error. Now, this is the same error that all the Greek thinkers made. They all thought that the bones formed first, then the flesh formed around it too. And so what seems more likely here is that Muhammad had learnt these embryological ideas not from Allah, but instead from Greek thought that had been passed down and had made its way to Arabia. So not only is there nothing miraculous about the embryological knowledge in the Quran, it's actually incorrect as well. A second claim that Muslims make is that the Quran describes the earth as being egg-shaped, which is miraculous because modern scientific findings reveal that the earth is not a perfect sphere but is indeed slightly egg-shaped. But the problem with this is that the Quran doesn't say that the earth is egg-shaped. There are 12 mentions of the shape of the earth in the Quran as far as I can tell, and all of them are pretty much flat, or at least spread out. 4 use the verb form mada, which means to spread, extend, elongate, stretch out. They are Surah 13 verse 3, and it is He who spread out the earth. Surah 15 verse 19, and the earth we have spread it out. Surah 50 verse 7, and the earth we have spread it out. And Surah 84 verse 3, and when the earth is spread out. 2 verses use the noun mad and 1 uses the noun mihad, and both of these mean cradle or bed or resting place, and the verb form means to even, flatten, grade, level out, pave or smoothen. They are Surah 20 verse 53, He who has made for you the earth like a carpet spread out, and Surah 43 verse 10, He who has made for you the earth like a carpet spread out, and Surah 78 verse 6, Have we not made the earth a resting place? An 8th verse is in Surah 51 verse 48, and the earth we have spread out. This uses the word farasha, which means to spread out, pave, tile or carpet. Number 9 is Surah 71 verse 19, and Allah has made for you the earth an expanse. This uses the word bisatan, which comes from the verb basata, which means to flatten, grade, level off, extend, outstretch or spread out. Number 10, Surah 79 verse 30, and after that he spread the earth. This uses the word dahaha, which comes from the verb daha, which means to stretch, extend or spread out, and I'll come back to this word in a minute. Surah 88 verse 20 is number 11, and at the earth how it is spread out, and this uses the word sutihat, which I'm not sure the exact definition beyond just to spread out, but nearby words include flatten, plane, surface, face or deck. And lastly, number 12, Surah 91 verse 6, and by the earth and he who spread it, uses the word tahaha from the verb taha, which means, again, I'm not sure the exact definition beyond just to spread out, but both those last two words get translated as spread or spread out, so that fits in with all the others. So that's all 12 instances, and there's a definite theme throughout. The general idea of spreading out, elongating, stretching, the words flattening, grading, levelling off appear like a carpet, rug or bed. So all of these depict fairly flat imagery. Now, out of all of these words, there's one word, dahaha, used in Surah 79 verse 30, and it's this word that is claimed to mean egg-shaped. It's said that the word dahaha is connected to another word, duhiyya, and duhiyya allegedly means ostrich egg. The problem is that I can't find any Arabic dictionary or lexicon or source anywhere that says that daha or duhiyya mean ostrich egg. What I could find, however, was several definitions that describe duhiyya as a place in the sand where an ostrich lays its eggs, and it originates from the root word daha because an ostrich would spread out the sand with its feet and make it wide to prepare it for its eggs. As you can see from Lane's Arabic English lexicon, it describes duhiyya as the place of the laying of eggs and of the hatching thereof of the ostrich in the sand, because the bird expands it and makes it wide with its foot or leg. So duhiyya describes the place in the sand where ostriches lay their eggs, and daha means spreading out, expanding, making wide. So absolutely no mention of either word meaning egg-shaped, and when you consider the fact that all 11 of the other words used to describe the shape of the earth in the Quran all share this idea of spreading out too, I think it's obvious to see that this egg association has been forced and manipulated and is plainly false. So the Quran does not say that the earth is egg-shaped. The overriding imagery associated with the earth is that it is spread out. Another argument used by Muslims is that the Quran describes the moon as having reflected light rather than its own light, and this is apparently miraculous because how could a desert nomad from the 7th century have known that the moon doesn't actually generate its own light, but instead reflects the light of the sun? Surah 10 verse 5 says, "It is he who made the sun a shining light and the moon a derived light." But again, the problem here is that it's not miraculous to have known that the moon reflects the sun's light in the 7th century. The Greeks knew this long before Muhammad just by noticing lunar eclipses and seeing the shadow cast onto the moon from the earth. Also, it's kind of obvious just by looking at the moon with your own eyes. You can tell by the way it lights up that it resembles the way light hits a spherical object, and the sun is always at the exact angle where you'd expect the light source to be coming from. So the moon obviously reflects the sun's light, and to claim that this is miraculous knowledge seems a bit audacious to me. Now this is the same thing we find with virtually all of the scientific foreknowledge claims. The so-called miraculous knowledge was actually already known by many cultures and was not miraculous at all. Another example is iron being sent down from meteorites. Surah 57 verse 25 says, "And we sent down iron in which lies great force and which has many uses for mankind." And it's claimed that there's no way Muhammad could have known this without the help of Allah. But many civilizations before the 7th century had already known this. Historian Peter Metavelis, in his book Mythical Stone, writes this: "The early widespread association of meteoric iron with the sky and with fire in the Old World lends further credence to such a link, as is suggested by the names people of that region gave the metal. The Egyptians called it stone of heaven, or produced by heaven, and the earliest known Sumerian word for iron meant sky or fire. The Hittites were the first known to make weapons from terrestrial iron, but they still called the metal fire from heaven. The Hittites believed that, unlike copper and gold, terrestrial iron originated in the sky. The Assyrians also extracted iron from terrestrial ore, and they likewise called it fragment from heaven." So the fact that the Quran describes iron as being sent down is not really much of a surprise, and is a long way from being miraculous. Another example is the immiscibility of salt water and fresh water. Surah 25 verse 53 says, "And it is he who has released simultaneously the two seas, one fresh and sweet and one salty and bitter, and he placed between them a barrier and a prohibiting partition." So the Quran's talking about how fresh water and salt water don't mix, and this is supposedly miraculous knowledge. But again, this was already known long before the 7th century. In Aristotle's work on meteorology, in Book 2, Part 2, he writes, "The drinkable water then is light and is all of it drawn up, the salt water is heavy and remains behind." And this pattern continues with virtually all of the scientific foreknowledge claims in the Quran. There is no scientific statements in the Quran that could not have been known by people living in the 7th century, and therefore there is no evidence in this respect of the supernatural. So now let's look at the prophetic evidence. Now, I found one website that claims that there are about 188 prophecies in the Quran, but I think that's a very, very liberal estimation. So far I've only come across about maybe 30 or 40, and most of these I don't think I'd even consider prophecies. So I wouldn't actually consider the Quran a particularly prophetic book, especially if you compare it to the Bible that has around 2,500 prophecies. A quarter of the Bible is prophecy, and they have a whole chunk of about 17 books dedicated to the prophets. So compared to that, you can already see that we don't have an awful lot of prophetic material in the Quran to really examine. But I'm going to go through the best ones I've found anyway. The first is in Surah 30 verses 2 to 4. It reads, "The Romans have been defeated in the nearest land, but they, after their defeat, will overcome within 3 to 9 years." So the story goes, the Romans had been defeated by the Persians in 619 AD. Muhammad is estimated to have written this verse between 619 and 622 AD. And in 627 AD, the Romans did indeed come back and defeat the Persians, which was within 3 to 9 years. So this is the best prophecy I've found in the Quran, because if all the dates are true, then there's a degree of falsifiability about it. It wasn't certain that the Romans would come back and defeat the Persians, so it could have been proven wrong. But here's the problem with it. The main problem is that the earliest evidence of a copy of the Quran we have is no earlier than 653 AD, when Uthman canonized the Quran and burnt all the deviating copies. That's 26 years after the event. So immediately this renders the prophecy pretty much useless as evidence. How can I be sure this verse was written in 622? How can I be sure that the 3 to 9 years part wasn't added later? Without hard evidence of the prophecy being written before the event of its fulfillment, what use is it? It'd be like me claiming that I predicted 9/11 but didn't write it down until last year. Who would believe me? The second problem is that even if there was proof it was written in 622, it still could easily have been an educated guess. Rome had already begun offensives in Armenia in 622 AD, so the clues were already there. There's also a lot we don't know about how informed Muhammad was about these events, and there also may have been good motive for Muhammad to tell his followers that Rome would soon be victorious. Perhaps it was somehow in their interests, and they were concerned and Muhammad wanted to reassure them. That's a possibility, so even if we could prove it was written in 622 AD, I still don't think it would require a divine explanation. Here's another, Surah 111 verses 1 to 4. May the hands of Abu Lahab be ruined, and ruined is he. His wealth will not avail him, and that which he gained, he will enter to burn in a fire of blazing flame, and his wife as well, the carrier of firewood. So the story here is that Abu Lahab was an enemy of Muhammad, and it's claimed that he and his wife died in a state of disbelief, therefore proving the prophecy that he burn in a fire of blazing flame. It's also claimed his children, I think, became Muslims, therefore fulfilling the part about his wealth and gains not availing him. Now, the first problem here, again, is that Abu Lahab died in 624 AD, 30 years before our first manuscript evidence, so we have no proof this prophecy was even written before the event. But secondly, it's unfalsifiable. The prophecy doesn't predict that Abu Lahab would never become a Muslim, it predicts that he'll go to hell. Even if he had converted to Islam, you could still argue that it made no difference because Allah had already sentenced him to hell. And how could you prove otherwise? Abu Lahab could have become the most saintly person to have ever lived in his last few years, and you could still argue that the prophecy holds true because it says he enters hell, and how could anyone disprove whether a person is in hell or not? If Allah says he will enter hell, he will enter hell regardless of what he does in his last few years. So it's unfalsifiable. And the third problem is that with this prophecy is that it's too vague. What does it mean for a person's wealth and gains to not avail them? Surely death is one way for your wealth and gains to cease benefiting you, and that's 100% certain to happen. Perhaps if he were very wealthy but lost all his wealth in his last years, you could argue that that fits the prophecy, but there's no mention of this happening in all of the literature I've read on Abu Lahab. And you could easily argue that this could have been an educated guess on Muhammad's part. The best that people claim is that his children converted to Islam and this fulfilled the prophecy. But I would have thought his children becoming Muslims would have given honour to his name, not shamed him. Seems like it's at least something that could have been interpreted either way, which again makes it unfalsifiable. So it's just too vague. It's unfalsifiable, it's also loaded in motive, as Abu Lahab was Muhammad's enemy, so of course he'd want to curse him with a verse like this. And because we have no manuscript evidence until 30 years after this all happened anyway, we're all just groping in the dark with maybes and conjecture, which is not a good basis for grounding your belief in God. Here's another one, Surah 24 verse 55. Allah has promised those who have believed among you and done righteous deeds that he will surely grant them succession to authority upon the earth, just as he granted it to those before them, and that he will surely establish for them therein their religion which he has preferred for them, and that he will surely substitute for them after their fear security. For they worship me, not associating anything with me. But whoever disbelieves after that, then those are the defiantly disobedient. And this could be coupled with another prophecy in Surah 110 which says, when the victory of Allah has come and the conquest, and you see the people entering in the religion of Allah in multitudes, then exalt him with praise of your Lord and ask for forgiveness of him. Indeed, he is ever accepting of repentance. So, in these two verses, Muhammad is basically saying to all his followers, don't worry, everything's going to be okay, we're going to be successful in the future. One day we'll have security and many people will join our religion. God promises. Well, surely this is very common and normal. I'd imagine almost every cult leader that gathers a following will promise their followers that they will be successful if they stick with them. And I doubt many would be frightened to use their special prophet powers to tell their followers that they've been assured of their future success by God himself. The only difference is that most cults vanish into history and we don't hear of their prophecies. But the few that manage to remain, their prophecies of future successes seem more noteworthy than they really are. And I mean, you see this all the time with kids who want to be famous or great. You ask them where they see themselves when they're older. Most of them will probably answer, I'm going to be an Olympic champion, I'm going to headline Glastonbury, I'm going to work for NASA, etc. Then when one of them actually achieves their dream and you look back at their prediction, you think it's amazing. But you forget that hundreds of thousands of others had the same prediction for their own lives, but failed, and we just forget about them. Every cult or religious group to have ever existed has most likely predicted similar future success. I mean, who wouldn't? So when one actually achieves some success, it shouldn't surprise us to find a prophecy like this amongst the teachings. I really don't think it's strange for a religious leader, particularly a religion as political and martial as Islam, to say to his followers that God has assured him that they will be victorious in their future battles. It encourages the followers and gives them belief. So I don't think these prophecies require a divine explanation. Just to give a quick sense of comparison, the Old Testament contains over 300 prophecies about Jesus, and because of the Septuagint, which was a translation of the Old Testament, we have confirmation that these prophecies in the Old Testament were written at least over 300 years before Jesus. Specific prophecies about where Jesus would be born, that he'd be crucified, the year that he would die, etc. Then on top of that, there are time-constrained prophecies about modern-day Israel that are being fulfilled in the modern age over 2,500 years after they were first recorded. And there are prophecies that say things like Isaiah 13:20, Babylon will never be inhabited, nor will it be settled from generation to generation, or Ezekiel 29:15, Egypt will never again exalt itself above the other nations. Now these are totally falsifiable claims. Whether or not they've been fulfilled is a debate for another video, but you can see how bold they are. If you compare this to many of the prophecies in the Quran, rather than claiming that certain events will never happen, they claim that certain events will happen at some point in the future, which means they have the whole of human history to be proven right. You just sit back and wait until the event happens, and then you can say, aha, fulfilled prophecy. If you predict an event will never happen, you have the whole of human history to be proven wrong. Do you see the difference? So this is why I hardly view these verses in the Quran to even be considered prophecies. Now there's a whole collection of verses like this that I found that are claimed to be miraculous prophecies, but when read in context are barely prophecies at all. The first is in Surah 41 verse 20, which reads, "Their skins will testify against them of what they used to do." Now this is apparently a prophecy about modern day fingerprinting technology, but if you read it in context it says, "And mention, O Muhammad, the day when the enemies of Allah will be gathered to the fire while they are driven assembled in rows, until when they reach it, their hearing and their eyes and their skins will testify against them of what they used to do." So this is talking about Judgment Day. Have we reached Judgment Day yet? No. So this can't have been fulfilled yet, and it can't be fulfilled until we reach Judgment Day, by which point it'll be too late anyway, so this prophecy can't be used as evidence. Another prophecy is in Surah 30 verse 41, which says, "Corruption has appeared throughout the land and sea by reason of what the hands of people have earned." Now this is apparently a prediction of environmental pollution from factory fumes, nuclear waste and things like that. But firstly, it's not even a prophecy, it's in the past tense. It says corruption has appeared, not will appear. But secondly, again, if you read the context, it's actually talking about unbelievers and those who associate other gods or partners with Allah. In context, these verses read, "Allah is the one who created you, then provided for you, then will cause you to die, and then will give you life. And are there any of your partners who does anything of that? Exalted is he, and high above what they associate with him. Corruption has appeared throughout the land and sea by reason of what the hands of people have earned, so he may let them taste part of the consequence of what they have done, that perhaps they will return to righteousness." So this passage is explaining that evil has purposely been spread around because of these unbelievers by Allah, so that he can let the evildoers taste a little bit of the consequence of their actions to try to get them to repent and return to Allah. Allah basically allowed evil to spread, to give them a warning or a kick up the bum to return to him. And this is all past tense, it's already happened, so it's not even a prophecy. Here's another, Surah 17 verse 104. And we said after him to the children of Israel, dwell in the land, and when there comes the promise of the hereafter, we will bring you forth in one gathering. So this is supposed to be a prophecy of the re-establishment of Israel in the middle of the 20th century. But there's two problems with this. Firstly, again, it's out of context. The passage is actually a retelling of the story of Moses. The full passage reads, and we had certainly given Moses 9 evident signs. So ask the children of Israel about when he came to them, and Pharaoh said to him, indeed I think, O Moses, that you are affected by magic. Moses said, you have already known that none has sent down these signs except the Lord of the heavens and the earth as evidence, and indeed I think, O Pharaoh, that you are destroyed. So he intended to drive them from the land, but drowned him and those with him altogether. And we said after Pharaoh to the children of Israel, dwell in the land, and when there comes the promise of the hereafter, we will bring you forth in one gathering. So, if anything, it's talking about the original promise God gave to the Israelites that has already been fulfilled after they wandered in the desert for 40 years. But secondly, if you want to read beyond that, then technically it actually says the Israelites won't be gathered until the hereafter, which is the afterlife. So we have another unfalsifiable claim, because you can just sit back and wait throughout the whole of human history for Israel to reform. And if it doesn't happen, you can just say, you can either say that the promise is for the afterlife, or you can say it's not a prophecy, it's just a retelling of the story of Moses that has already occurred. So you can't lose. It's vague enough and open-ended enough that it can be interpreted in a way that could fit any scenario, which renders it useless as evidence. Here's one more, Surah 4 verse 119. They will alter the creation of Allah. This is supposed to be a prophecy of plastic surgery and cloning and genetic engineering. But unfortunately, this is refuted by Muslims' own sources. In the commentary of Ibn Kathir, one of the most highly respected scholars in Islam, he writes that the line, and indeed I will order them to change the nature created by Allah, means tattooing. In his Sahih, Muslim recorded the prohibition of tattooing the face, which in one of its wording states, may Allah curse whoever does this. It is also recorded in the Sahih that Ibn Mas'ud said, may Allah curse those who have tattoos and those who do it, who pluck their facial hairs, and the one who does it for them, and those who make spaces between their teeth for the purpose of beauty, changing what Allah has created. So that's what was meant by this verse. Nothing to do with modern day plastic surgery and genetic engineering. And if you read the prophecy in full, you'll see that it's referring to the unbelievers at the time. There's no indication that this is a prophecy for the distant future, so this one fails too. Now, there's another handful just like this, such as when the wild beasts are herded together, that's supposed to be a prophecy about modern day zoos, and when the female infant buried alive is questioned, that's supposed to be foretelling of women's rights. But in context, both of these are from Surah 81, which is all about Judgment Day again. And this really is the pattern with every prophecy I've come across. Most of them are out of context and are either about Judgment Day or aren't prophecies at all. Many are too vague or unfalsifiable, and of the few that I would actually even consider to be true prophecies, their fulfillments came so quickly after the prediction that we don't have any manuscript evidence to prove that they weren't altered after the event, and they could easily have been educated guesses anyway. So hopefully I've been able to show you that the prophetic evidence for the Quran is practically non-existent. Next, I'd like to look at the mathematical miracle claims now. There are two main claims I've come across. The first is the claim that the number 19 appears throughout the Quran in a number of miraculous, improbable ways. So, for example, the first verse of the Quran, known as the Basmala, consists of exactly 19 letters. There are 114 surahs in the Quran, that's 19 times 6. The total number of verses in the Quran is 6,346, which is 19 times 334. And if you add the total verse numbers up as individual digits, so 6 plus 3 plus 4 plus 6, you get 19 as well. The basmala occurs 114 times in the Quran, that's 19 times 6. Out of all the surahs, there's one that doesn't mention the basmala, Surah 9, and there's one that mentions it twice, Surah 27, and the difference between these two surahs is exactly 19 surahs, and on and on. There are many more occurrences of the number 19, and basically, on the face of it, it appears massively improbable that the number 19 would seemingly fit so perfectly in the Quran. And the second claim is that there are certain words in the Quran that are mentioned in symmetrical or coincidental ways. So, for example, the word day appears in the Quran exactly 365 times. The word month appears 12 times. Also, many opposite words appear in identical amounts. So, paradise and hell both appear 77 times each. Plant and tree appear 26 times each. Payment and reward appear 117 times, and on, and there's a whole handful of these. Well, I think there are three things going on here. Firstly, what we're seeing are all the hits. What we don't see are all the misses, and I'll explain this in a minute. The second thing is that number patterns that appear naturally are being used to make one coincidence seem like several coincidences. And the third thing that's going on is arbitrary qualifications. But let me explain. If you picked a number at random between 1 and 1,000,000, what are the chances it would be a multiple of 19? 1 in 19, right? Pretty much. Because every 19th number is a multiple of 19. Now in the Quran there are various ways of cooking up numbers. You can count the number of letters, the number of words, sentences, verses, surahs. You can count the numbers between particular verses, words and surahs. You can add up groups of numbers to make other numbers. You can count how many times a particular word appears, etc, etc. Now if you collect up all these numbers, you're going to have a whole bunch of numbers. Now out of all these numbers, how many would you expect to be a multiple of 19? About 1 in 19, right? Well, this is pretty much what you find. If you look at, for example, the number of verses in each surah, the number of verses in each surah, out of all 114 surahs, 4 of them are multiples of 19, which is about what you'd expect. So there's nothing miraculous there. But what you'll find is that the 4 surahs that do have verse numbers in multiples of 19, these will be used as part of this miracle claim. And people will find something significant about these surahs to make it seem more incredible, even though there's probably something unique in every surah that could be used to make it seem more significant. And so what we see are the hits, and what we don't see are the misses. Another example of this is when ranges of surah numbers are added together to produce a number divisible by 19. So from Surah 9, where there is no basmala, to Surah 27, where there are 2 basmalas, if you add up the numbers 9 plus 10 plus 11 plus 12, etc., all the way to 27, you get 342, which is a multiple of 19, which is apparently a miracle. But what you don't see is this technique being used again between any other significant surahs. So if you added up the surah numbers between the first surah and Surah 9, for instance, you get 45, but that's not divisible by 19. If you try between Surah 9 and Surah 22, the surah about the pilgrimage to the Hajj, well no, that comes to 217, that's not divisible by 19. How about between 9 and 23, the surah about the believers? Nope, that comes to 240, not divisible by 19. What about if we start at the 19th surah and go to other surahs? Will we get any hits then? Well no, you can go between 19 and 20, 19 and 21, 19 and 22, all the way up to 19 and 37 before you get your first hit. Now is there anything significant about Surah 37? Well no, not really. But I'm sure if you dug deep enough you could pull out some meaning. So again, we're told about the hits, but what we don't see are all the misses. I hope this is making sense. Basically, you have to take the rules used for one miracle claim and extend them across the whole sample space to see whether there really are true statistical anomalies or not. Now this leads me on to the second force acting on these miracle claims. When you play around with maths, you'll notice lots of natural patterns occurring, but often there will be a cluster of several of these miracle claims that are really just one coincidence, but they've caught the wave of one of these naturally occurring number patterns and applied the original coincidence to it, and then churned out several other so-called miraculous numbers from it. So, for example, there are 114 surahs in the Quran. That is indeed a multiple of 19. But then some people will say that if you add up all the surah numbers, 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 all the way up to 114, it equals 6,555, which amazingly is also a multiple of 19. Except this isn't amazing at all. It's simply a natural pattern that occurs. If you add up 1 plus 2 plus 3 up to 19, you get 190, a multiple of 19. If you add from 1 to 38, which is 2 times 19, you get 741, which is a multiple of 19. If you go from 19 to 38, you get 570, a multiple of 19. If you go from 38 to 57, which is 3 times 19, you get 950, a multiple of 19. And so this is a naturally occurring pattern, and it occurs with all odd numbers. You can see the same pattern with the numbers 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, etc. You will always find this pattern. So, for example, if the Quran happened to have 81 surahs in it, and the miracle number was the number 9, you could say that not only is 81 a multiple of 9, but if you add all the surahs together, 1 plus 2 plus 3 up to 81, you get 3,321, which is also a multiple of 9. Now this isn't miraculous. It's just a naturally occurring number pattern. It will happen with any odd number. And this is the same trick used between surahs 9 and 27. There are 19 surahs between 9 and 27. Great, there's the first coincidence. But then to say that if you add 9 plus 10 plus 11, etc., all the way up to 27, you get 342, which is also a multiple of 19, this isn't miraculous. This will always happen with odd numbers. If the difference between any two numbers is n, and you add that range of numbers up cumulatively, the answer will always be a multiple of n, if n is an odd number. And this leads me on to the third factor, arbitrary qualification. You may have noticed that the difference between 9 and 27 isn't actually 19, it's 18. 27 minus 9 is 18. But for this miracle claim to work, you have to treat both 9 and 27, both Surah 9 and 27, as inclusive. Now we have three options here. We can either treat Surahs 9 and 27 as inclusive, making the difference 19, or we could count in the common sense way, which would give a difference of 18, or we could exclude Surahs 9 and 27, giving a difference of 17. Now why should we choose the inclusive option over the others? My guess is that if the number 19 had happened to fall into any one of these three camps, it would have still been claimed as a miracle. And the problem with this is that when you go searching for the number 19, if you can bend the rules in various ways to give you a range of targets to choose from, you're increasing the likelihood of finding a hit, and therefore reducing the miraculousness of the claim. Another example of this is with the word day. The claim is that it appears 365 times in the Quran. The only problem is that the word day appears 481 times, according to corpus.quran.com. Now, if you qualify it by only looking at the word day that comes from the root Arabic word yawm, you get 405 mentions, which is closer. If you qualify it further by only counting the occasions when it says a day or the day, and ignoring all other plural forms with suffixes or personal pronouns like their day, your day, or days, then by my count you get 341. Now, I assume there are further ways to qualify this, so that you can manipulate the numbers to come out at exactly 365, and if the same rules were applied across the board for all these claims, I'd take it a bit more seriously. But as you go through all the different words that are claimed to appear in miraculous amounts, you'll find that different rules are applied to different words. Sometimes the plural forms are included in the number, sometimes not. Sometimes forms with suffixes or pronouns are included, sometimes not. Sometimes the verb forms are included, sometimes not. And the problem with this is that with every additional qualification you allow, you're generating for yourself an additional number to see if 19 multiplies into it or not. And with each additional qualification, the odds increase. With 2 variables, the odds go from 1 in 19 to 1 in 9.5. With 3 variables, the odds are 1 in 6.3. With 4, the odds are 1 in 4.75. And once you've got just 10 different parameters that you can use to tweak the numbers, the odds are already below 1 in 2. And when you combine this with the other 2 factors I just mentioned, the odds are practically certain that number patterns like this can be found. And so you can see that there really isn't anything miraculous at all going on here. It's simply a clever trick. Now there's also a 4th factor I could have mentioned, which is called confirmation bias. When I was a teenager, my sister went to Japan. After she left, all of a sudden I kept hearing about Japan everywhere. In the news, in conversations, in adverts, everywhere. And I thought, isn't that strange? Maybe God's trying to send me a message. But when I got older, I learnt about confirmation bias. The truth was, the number of times I encountered Japan in my life before my sister left was most likely exactly the same as after she left. The difference was that any mention of Japan before she left, I just never registered because I wasn't looking for it. I didn't care about Japan, so it seemed to me like Japan wasn't mentioned very often. But after my sister left, suddenly I was much more interested in Japan, and so I was looking out for it. And now every mention of Japan caught my attention, and I remembered it, and it seemed to me like Japan was suddenly being mentioned everywhere. I think this is a very powerful and subtle trick that our minds can play on us if we're not alert to it, and I think it can misguide us in situations like this with miraculous number claims. I'd love to go into more detail, but I don't want this to drag out too long, but I'll just go through a few more specific examples of these miracle claims. The word day appearing 365 times. One other thing to note is that in Islam, the lunar calendar is actually considered the true calendar, and that has 354 days, so there's an added problem there. The word month only appears 11 times according to corpus.quran.com, not 12. If you count all the plural forms, it's 21 times. To make this one work, you have to pinch one of the usages in plural forms, and this is justified because one of the plural forms has the number 12 in front of it. So for some reason that's allowed, which seems like another arbitrary qualification to me. Paradise and hell are said to appear 77 times each, except paradise is actually mentioned 52 times. And if you look at the root word Jannat, you'll find an additional 95 mentions that are translated as gardens. So that one's a long way off, and we'll need quite a bit of qualifying to make that work. Also, the words tree and plant are said to appear 26 times each, and again there's an awful lot of misses that we're not seeing here. Tree and plant are just 2 associated words. There is nothing uniquely significant about their connection. And so what about other words such as root, garden, field, leaves, seed, grow, etc.? Any of these could have been used if their word count had happened to match the word count of another associated word. If you look at the sample space of all associated words and their word counts, the majority of them don't hit. All that we see are the few times when it does hit. We can also see in this example the arbitrary use of qualification because there are actually 27 mentions of the word tree, not 26. To make this one work, you have to discount the verb form of tree, which is shajara, and then you get 26. But the problem is that plant only appears 26 times if you do count the verb form, which is tambutu. Another claim is the basmala having 19 letters. Well, I don't speak Arabic, so I can't be sure about this one, but from what I've researched, some grammarians regard alif and hamza as 2 distinct letters, while others regard them as one. Another source I found claims that the basmala only contains 19 letters if we ignore 2 unwritten vowel letters of the second and third words, aleph, but include the vowel letter of the third word, yeah, even though all 3 vowels are subject to identical grammatical rules. Apparently double letters can be counted as 1 or 2 letters as well. Now I can't confirm this one, but what seems apparent is that there is wiggle room to wean out different numbers, and again for every added variable the odds increase and the miraculousness decreases. Now every case I've come across, I've found some sort of manipulation of the numbers, And if you consider the three factors I've mentioned, that firstly, we only see the hits, what we don't see is the complete sample space of results that contains a majority of misses. Secondly, many of the claims have been generated from just one coincidence by piggybacking on natural number patterns and claiming them as miracles in their own right. And thirdly, because there are so many ways to tweak the numbers by making all kinds of arbitrary qualifications, the odds of finding a few hits are almost certain. Add to this our human propensities for pattern recognition and our natural confirmation bias, and I think this shows that these miracle math claims are nothing but a clever trick. Now, the last area to look at is the perfection of the Quran itself. This is traditionally the main argument given by Muslims. Now, there are three particular claims that are made in the argument from the perfection of the Quran. The first is that it is free from error, grammatical and doctrinal, and that it contains zero contradictions. In Surah 482 it says, "Then do they not reflect upon the Quran? If it had been from any other than Allah, they would have found within it much contradiction." The second claim is that when the Quran is listened to in Arabic, it has a beauty that can only be explained by God. Now, I'm not sure if this claim is actually in the Quran or even in the Hadith, but I've heard this claim a few times, so I'm going to examine it anyway. And the third claim is that it can't be replicated. In Surah 17 verse 88 it says, "If mankind and the jinn gathered in order to produce the like of this Quran, they could not produce the like of it, even if they were to each other assistants." And also in Surah 2 verse 23 it says, "And if you are in doubt about what we have sent down upon our servant Muhammad, then produce a surah the like thereof and call upon your witnesses other than Allah if it should be truthful." So there are three main claims from the perfection of the Quran. So firstly, the claim that it is free from error and contradiction. Well, the first point to make about that, as I said earlier, is that a book that is free from error and contradiction is not necessarily evidence of the supernatural. It is not a feat that is beyond human capacity to achieve. It doesn't seem hard to imagine that if a person or group of people were careful enough and reviewed their work enough, and their writings weren't overly complicated, then I don't think it's unimaginable that they could complete it without any contradictions or errors. Now, the Bible is a collection of 66 different books that were written by 40 different authors, coming from many different walks of life from 3 different continents, using 3 different languages over a period of roughly 2,000 years. Now, for a book like that to have no doctrinal contradictions is a lot more impressive than a book like the Quran that has basically just come from one person, Muhammad. And I think there's a good chance Muhammad had some form of assistance too. I mean, there had to have been some sort of concerted effort to gather together all of Muhammad's teachings that were originally given in verbal form and memorized into some kind of written book. And during that process, would anybody really be able to prove that there weren't revisions and corrections going on? So even if the Quran is free from error and contradiction, I don't think that means it must be supernatural. There are many human explanations that could be given. But the second point to make is that the Quran isn't free from error. I've come across quite a few, and there's a website called wikiislam.net that lists several hundred of them that I'll link below. I'd like to just go through 3 errors for now. The first is that in the Quran, the Virgin Mary, mother of Jesus, has been confused with another biblical character called Miriam, who lived over 1,000 years earlier. Muhammad seems to think they're the same person. In the Old Testament, Miriam is the sister of Moses and Aaron, and their father is Amran, or Imran in Arabic, which you'll find in 1 Chronicles chapter 6 verse 3. And so in Surah 19 verses 27 to 28 it says, "Then she brought him," Jesus, "to her people, carrying him. They said, 'O Mary, you have certainly done a thing unprecedented. O sister of Aaron, your father was not a man of evil, nor was your mother unchaste.'" So we can see here that the Virgin Mary is believed to have a brother called Aaron. Now, maybe she did, maybe it's just a coincidence and it's a different Aaron. Well, let's look further. In Surah 66 verse 12 it says, "And Mary the daughter of Imran, who guarded her chastity." So here we see the Virgin Mary's father was believed to be Imran. Now, is this just another coincidence? Did both Miriam and Mary have a brother and father named Aaron and Imran? Bear in mind that according to tradition, the Virgin Mary's parents were actually called Anne and Joachim. Now, if we look in the Hadith, the followers of Muhammad actually noticed this problem too and asked him about it. In Sahih Muslim 2135 it says, Mughira bin Shuba reported, when I came to Najran, they, the Christians of Najran, asked me, you read, O sister of Harun, that's Aaron, in the Quran, whereas Moses was born much before Jesus. When I came back to Allah's messenger, I asked him about that, whereupon he said, the people of the old age used to give names to their persons after the names of apostles and pious persons who had gone before them. So Muhammad's explanation is that Mary is named after Miriam. Well, does that make sense? For that to make sense, you'd have to argue that when Mary is referred to as the sister of Aaron and the daughter of Imran, that this was some kind of customary signal of the person she's named after. So it's like, if I was named after Charlie Sheen, whose dad is Martin Sheen, it'd be like referring to me as Charlie, son of Martin, even though my dad is called Jack. Which seems a bit weird to me, because it's a bit misguiding for starters. You'd think adding the son of part was there for clarification. But also it's a bit disrespectful to my dad, Jack, as well. But the real problem with it is that there's another verse in Surah 3, verse 35 to 36, which reads, when the wife of Imran said, my Lord, indeed I have pledged to you what is in my womb, consecrated for your service, so accept this from me, indeed you are the hearing, the knowing. But when she delivered her, she said, my Lord, I have delivered a female, and Allah was most knowing of what she delivered, and the male is not like the female, and I have named her Mary, and I seek refuge for her in you, and for her descendants from Satan the expelled. So here we have confirmation again that Imran's wife is the mother of Mary, and therefore Imran is her father. But this time it's not in the form of a kind of customary signal. So this seems to me like a fairly large error, and what seems more probable is that however Muhammad learnt about biblical stories, he learnt about them in imperfect word-of-mouth, Chinese whisper kind of ways. And little bits of confusion like this have seeped in, which would be perfectly understandable if the book were not claimed to be the perfect word of Allah. So that's error number 1. Error number 2 is a fairly substantial contradiction. In Surah 2 verse 256 it says, there is no compulsion in religion. And in Surah 109 verse 6 it says, for you is your religion and for me is my religion. But in Surah 9 verse 29 it says, fight those who do not believe in Allah. And in Surah 9 verse 123 it says, O you who have believed, fight those adjacent to you of the disbelievers and let them find in you harshness. And in Surah 8 verse 12 it says, I will cast terror into the hearts of those who disbelieve, so strike them upon the necks and strike from them every fingertip. So this seems like a pretty substantial doctrinal contradiction to me when it's said that there is no compulsion in religion and for you is your religion and for me is my religion. It's usually understood that this means you can believe whatever you want to believe and Muslims will not harm you or pressure you in any way about it. But if that's the case, then how can a Muslim simultaneously fight non-believers with harshness and strike their necks and fingertips? These two sets of instructions are at total odds with each other. I can't see how they can be squared. You either leave non-believers alone or you fight them. So how do Muslims get out of this? Well, there are actually 2 ways you can get out of this contradiction, but they both lead you into other problems. The first is to argue that the first 2 peaceful verses mean something different. When it says no compulsion, what it really means is that people ultimately decide for themselves, that it's ultimately a personal decision regardless of how much you try to sway them. Notice that there is no explicit instruction here that says don't go around compelling people to believe. It just says there is no compulsion in religion, like a statement of fact. So you could argue that the verse is just saying if a person doesn't believe, then that's their free choice, but they still deserve whatever consequences may come of that choice, be it hellfire or the wrath of Muslims. Similarly, with the second verse, for you is your religion and for me is my religion. Technically, there are no actual specific instructions here that call Muslims to treat non-believers peacefully. It's just a statement of fact. So there's no reason to assume this is necessarily a peaceful passage. In fact, if you read the surah in full, it actually sounds more like a statement of futility, as though there's a wall between people with different faiths that can never be crossed. The surah in full is this: O disbelievers, I do not worship what you worship, nor are you worshippers of what I worship, nor will I be a worshipper of what you worship, nor will you be a worshipper of what I worship. For you is your religion, and for me is my religion. So you could argue that these peaceful passages are not actually instructions for how Muslims should treat non-Muslims peacefully, and therefore there is no contradiction, which is great. But unfortunately, what you're left with is not a religion of peace. And the second way to get around this contradiction is through the principle of abrogation. In the Quran, there is a concept whereby if two verses ever contradict each other, the later verse is said to cancel out the earlier verse, which may sound a bit convenient to you, as it does to me. If Muhammad really was speaking the eternal words of God, then how come they keep changing? It kind of sounds like something you'd come up with if you'd just been caught out, and evidently many of Muhammad's contemporaries felt the same way. In Surah 16 verse 101 it says, and when we substitute a verse in place of a verse, and Allah is most knowing of what he sends down, they say, you, O Muhammad, are but an inventor of lies, but most of them do not know. So abrogation may seem like a dubious concept, but if we grant the principle for now, then you could argue that the later verses simply cancel out the earlier verses, and therefore there is no contradiction. But again, unfortunately, the peaceful verses are the earlier ones, and so it's the violent passages that take precedence. In fact, Surah 9 is the second to last surah that was revealed, and it contains probably the most violent passages in all of the Quran. So again, to escape the contradiction, you're forced to give up the idea that Islam is a religion of peace. So that's a second error. One final error is in Surah 18 verses 83 to 86. It reads, and they ask you, O Muhammad, about Dhul Qarnayn, that's supposedly Alexander the Great. Say, I will recite to you about him a report. Indeed, we established him upon the earth, and we gave him to everything away. So he followed away, until when he reached the setting of the sun, he found it setting in a spring of dark mud, and he found near it a people. So here we have a verse that claims that the sun sets in a spring of dark mud. Other translations describe it as a muddy spring or murky water, but these are all obviously wrong. The sun does not set in a muddy spring. In fact, there is no place where the sun sets. So this is a big error. Now there are two ways I've come across that Muslims use to try to get out of this. The first is to argue that the real meaning of the text is that it only appeared to Dhul Qarnayn that the sun set in a murky spring, kind of like when the sun sets over the ocean, it looks as though it's descending into the water. But there are various problems with this. For instance, what sense does it make to say that he reached a specific place with people nearby where the sun appears to set? Surely everywhere is a place where you can see the sun appearing to set. Why single out one place and say that this is the place where the sun appears to set? So that seems like a stretch to me, but there's an additional way out, which is to argue that when it says he reached the setting of the sun, what it really means is that he reached the time of the setting of the sun, not the place. So he reached the setting of the sun means he reached the time when the sun sets. Now, though this seems like another stretch to me, you can almost contort the verses to just about escape this problem, except for one more final piece of evidence, and that's the Hadith by Abu Dawood, which is considered by Muslims to be one of the most trusted books of the Hadith. It says in Hadith number 4002, Abu Dar said, I was sitting behind the Apostle of Allah, that's Muhammad, who was riding a donkey while the sun was setting. He asked, do you know where this sets? I replied, Allah and his apostle know best. He said, it sets in a spring of warm water. So here we have confirmation in a trusted Islamic book from the 9th century that Muhammad did indeed believe that the sun sets in a spring of water. and I can't see how this one can be reinterpreted. The question asked was, do you know where this sets? So it's definitely a location-based question and not time-based. And the answer Muhammad gives is that it sets in a spring of warm water. He didn't say it appears to set in a spring of warm water, and if he had, I think it would have been a very strange answer to a question that Muhammad himself had asked. He asked, do you know where this sets, not where it appears to set. Saying it appears to set in a spring of warm water would not be answering the question. Basically, a common sense approach to these passages is to conclude that Muhammad believed that the sun sets in a spring of water. That's the way it reads. So that's a third error. Now, that's just 3. There are plenty more I've found, but I haven't got time to go into right now, such as the Earth being flat, which we kind of went over earlier, the Earth being made first and then the stars in the sky second. Sometimes it says the universe was created in 6 days, other times 8 days. Some verses say Allah forgives all sins, other verses mention sins that Allah does not forgive. Some verses say drinking alcohol is okay, others say it's a sin, and on and on. As I said, there are hundreds more listed on a website called Wiki Islam, and so the claim that the Quran is absolutely free from error and contradiction and that this is proof of the supernatural, I believe, can be refuted quite easily. The second claim is that the beauty of the Quran in its original Arabic is proof of the supernatural. Now, remember, to be considered supernatural, we're looking for feats that are beyond human capacity to achieve. Is writing a very beautiful book something that is beyond human capacity to achieve? Well, no, obviously not. There are loads of beautiful books in the world, Shakespeare, Dante's The Divine Comedy, but with none of these do we conclude that the authors must be prophets of God. We just conclude that they're very talented. Now, Muslims may argue that the Quran goes beyond what a mere human could achieve, because the linguistic patterns and structures are too perfect. But this is entering the realm of mathematical patterns again, and as I showed before, these can be very deceptive. People will often count the hits but ignore the misses, and often people will force and manipulate the data to fit their conclusions. And this is the same basic story when it comes to the claims of linguistic miracles too. One other argument Muslims may give is that Muhammad was illiterate and was not a naturally gifted poet, and therefore that makes the beauty of the Quran miraculous. But being illiterate doesn't mean Muhammad wasn't intelligent. In fact, in Ash-Shifa, one of the most highly regarded biographies of Muhammad, it says, if all the intelligence of humanity from the first to the last were to be gathered as one, it would be in comparison to the intelligence of the Prophet as a single grain of sand. Now, personally, I think this is probably an exaggeration, but this is the popular Muslim opinion of Muhammad, that he was the most intelligent human to have ever lived. And therefore, if this is the case, then it's hardly miraculous for someone like him to come up with something like the Quran. And so I just don't see any evidence to conclude that the beauty of the Quran is anything beyond what a mere human could achieve. Now, the third claim from the perfection of the Quran is that it is inimitable. It can't be reproduced. In Surah 17 verse 88, Muhammad said, if all mankind and the jinn came together, they could still not produce the like of this Quran. And in Surah 11 verse 13, he challenges the doubters to produce just 10 chapters like it. And in Surah 2 verse 23, he challenges them to bring just 1 chapter like it. Now, on the face of it, this just seems mad. Of course somebody could produce something like it. Bear in mind, some of the surahs are very short, just a few sentences long, like Surah 95. As the jewel of the 7 strong, Allah is without partners, exalted in might. And verily we have certainly beautified the earth and adorned it with great mountains and bountiful waters. Indeed he is of all things seeing. That's it. Surely it's possible to write something similar, right? Well, the astute among you may have noticed what I've just done, but for those that didn't, the surah I just quoted is fictional. I just made it up for the purpose of making this point that it seems pretty easy on the face of it. Now, maybe Muhammad meant something different. Maybe Muhammad means that his writings are inimitable in the same way that an artist's work is unique. And if so, then I'd pretty much agree. But there would be nothing supernatural about this. If you tried to produce a painting like Picasso or Leonardo da Vinci, you'd most likely fail, because not only are they masters of their art, but they have their own unique style too. Now, you do actually have professional forgers who manage to fool a lot of people, but then you also get art experts who are able to spot a fake too. But if this is all that Muhammad means, then I don't really care, because it wouldn't be a supernatural claim. It'd just be a claim of artistic uniqueness. But if Muhammad means that the Quran's inimitability is proof that it could only have come from Allah, then what he's suggesting is that writing just one surah of the Quran is a feat that is beyond human capacity to achieve alone. Now just think for a moment of the greatest achievements that human beings have ever accomplished. The pyramids of Egypt that are so amazing they've led many conspiracy theorists to conclude they must have been built by aliens, the astronomical precision achieved by the Mayans, or the Sistine Chapel painting by Michelangelo, or right up to today with things like the Hadron Collider and the internet. The things that human beings can achieve are incredible. To suggest that the whole of mankind and the jinn together could not produce just a few sentences of prose similar to the Quran is just so insane. I can't believe I've just wasted 5 minutes talking about it. The only way a surah of the Quran could be truly inimitable in a supernatural sense is if it was loaded with incredibly precise codes and patterns that are so intricate even the greatest mathematicians couldn't crack it. But as I showed earlier, there is nothing miraculous about the mathematical patterns in the Quran. So I really can't see how the Quran itself could be used as evidence of the supernatural. It's not free from error and contradiction, and even if it were, that wouldn't be evidence of the supernatural. There is nothing supernatural about writing a beautiful book, and the claim that it is inimitable is clearly false. So I think the argument from the perfection of the Quran fails. And so we've looked at all 4 of the supernatural criteria now, and in each one I believe the Quran fails. Scientifically, there is nothing in the Quran that couldn't have been known at the time of writing. Prophetically, there aren't many prophecies in the Quran, and of the few there are, they're either out of context, too vague, or were fulfilled before the earliest manuscript evidence that we have. The mathematical codes I've shown are just a clever trick, and the argument from the Quran itself fails because it's not free from error or contradiction, it's not inimitable, and its alleged beauty does not require a supernatural explanation. So that's the supernatural criteria. So we don't really need to look at the natural criteria, as we've already discovered that the Quran cannot be the word of God. But let's take a brief look anyway, because it can help to give us a more complete picture of what the Quran's all about. Now, I haven't studied the natural criteria anywhere near as exhaustively as the supernatural criteria, so this will just be a collection of some of my incomplete opinions on the matter. So, as I said earlier, we're looking for 2 things with the natural criteria: alignment with reality and no contradictions. Well, I've already shown earlier that there are several contradictions in the Quran, and there's many more I could go into, so already we're off to a shaky start. But let's see how the Quran lines up with reality. So we'll begin with history. Does the Quran align accurately with history? Well, it seems to me like the historical knowledge in the Quran has been acquired through slightly faulty avenues. Maybe the teachers that taught Muhammad had slightly faulty accounts of history, because what we often find are historical stories, but with slight differences to the originals. So for instance, the Quran attests that Jesus existed and was a prophet and performed miracles, etc., but they don't believe he was crucified. But the crucifixion is one of the few things about Jesus that virtually all historians agree upon. There are all kinds of sources that attest the crucifixion of Jesus: Roman historians, Tacitus and Lucian of Samosata, and even Jewish sources confirm it, despite their view that Jesus was not the Messiah. So the Quran seems to be in the wrong here. It's also claimed in the Quran that the Jews viewed Ezra as the son of God, but this is clearly false. It was precisely the view that God has no sons that caused the Jews to reject Jesus. So the Quran seems to be in error here too. It also mentions Alexander the Great and seems to talk about him like he was a righteous man and was guided by Allah, despite the fact that Alexander the Great claimed to be the son of Amun, the god of Egypt. And I mentioned earlier that the Quran thinks that Mary and Miriam were the same person, despite them living over 1,000 years apart. And there are lots of these little dodgy pieces of historical information that are part fact, part fiction throughout the Quran, which for me further confirms that this is a book written by man, not by God. Next, does the Quran align with moral realities? Well, for me, it's here that the Quran displays the most concerning dislocation from reality. Now, obviously, the problem with making moral judgments is how do I know that I am right and the Quran is wrong? But I think this is the nature of moral arguments. I think we all have a moral sense, and I think when we reason morally, we can all instinctively tell when something is right or wrong. So what I'm going to do is just tell you about some of the teachings in the Quran that my own moral sense objects to, and assume that your moral sense will object to it too. Now, don't get me wrong, there are definitely a lot of good teachings in the Quran, and in many ways we could all learn a lot from the Muslim example. In terms of their devotion to God and their self-discipline and keeping the daily prayers and abstaining from alcohol and other practices. And there are a lot of good verses in the Quran that call Muslims to act justly and honestly and to be kind to others and to help the needy, etc. So there's a lot of good in the Quran. But unfortunately, there's quite a lot of bad too, and I would say more so than any of the other major religions. Now, before I get into the really objectionable parts of the Quran, there's one moral flaw that stands out to me more than any other, and that's the absence of the concept of unconditional love. Love is generally conditional throughout the book, and the conditions are often quite harsh and demanding. The overwhelming theme throughout the Quran is that if you believe and do righteous deeds, then Allah might decide to extend love to you if He wills. But if you disbelieve or don't do righteous deeds, you've got no chance. You are the enemy of Allah. He does not love you. Now, for me, unconditional love is in a far higher moral sphere than conditional love. To me, unconditional love is a beautiful thing wherever I see it in life. The way a parent loves their rebellious child, or the way a family accepts and supports you despite all your weaknesses. This is the kind of love we see in the Bible. God loves us all, no matter what. No matter how many sins you've committed, and no matter whether you believe in Him or not, He still loves you. And for me, this affects everything we do. When we know we're secure and loved unconditionally, our motivations change. We no longer act out of fear and guilt. We act because we're free to do so, and we act out of purely intrinsic motivations. It's such a beautiful and freeing feeling to carry with you through life, and it's this I worry Muslims might be missing out on. And one of the saddest doctrines in Islam that highlights this lack of freedom is the condemnation of apostasy. If a Muslim converts away from Islam, the orthodox punishment is death. Though the Quran isn't explicit about it, but Surah 88 verses 22 to 24, it says, "But whoever turns back and disbelieves, Allah will chastise him with the greatest chastisement." And Surah 4 verse 89, "But if they turn away from the faith, then seize them and kill them wherever you find them, and take not from among them any ally or helper." So the Quran is obviously against the idea of Muslims leaving the religion, and the Hadith is even clearer. In Sahih Bukhari 3017, Muhammad said, "If a Muslim discards his religion, kill him." So you can't get much clearer than that. So in Islam, it's a very grave crime to leave the faith. And so this is not freedom of religion. How are you meant to form unbiased opinions about God and life when you have a gun to your head, so to speak? It's totally going to skew your judgment. My guess is that the majority of Muslims have not freely chosen to follow Allah. If you're a Muslim right now and the thought of converting away from Islam troubles you because of what your family or community or even your country's government might think or worse do to you, then you have not chosen freely. Another doctrine that compounds this problem further is the view towards unbelievers. Bill Warner, the founder of the Center of the Study of Political Islam, calculated that 64% of the Quran is devoted to the unbeliever, and it's not a very positive 64% either. Surah 98 verse 6 describes unbelievers as the worst of creatures, while in Surah 3 verse 110 Muslims are described as the best of peoples. And in Surah 9 verse 29 it says, "Fight those who do not believe in Allah or in the last day, and who do not consider unlawful what Allah and His Messenger have made unlawful, and who do not adopt the religion of truth from those who were given the scripture. Fight until they give the jizya," which is a kind of second-class citizen tax, "with willing submission and feel themselves subdued." So here Muslims are ordered to fight other people based on their beliefs, not based on self-defense or anything like that. And in Surah 8 verse 12 it says, "I will cast terror into the hearts of those who disbelieve. Therefore strike off their heads and strike off every fingertip of them. Which shows we're not talking about a spiritual type of fighting here, it's explicitly physical. And there are plenty more verses just like this throughout the Quran. And so not only is this another example of a lack of freedom of choice, but it's also blatantly immoral. Just because somebody doesn't believe the same things as you doesn't make them the worst of creatures worthy of death. They just see life from a different angle to you. At worst you could say that they're misguided, but certainly not deserving of hatred. If the verses said, talk with those who disbelieve, so that you may help to further each other's understandings, then that'd be fine. But to chop their heads off is just plainly barbaric. Now this leads me on to another grim doctrine of the Quran, the death penalty. Murder receives the death penalty, which alone is arguably immoral, but also apostasy, as I mentioned earlier, and adultery are also capital crimes, and the methods of punishment include stoning, hanging and beheading. In Sahih Bukhari 6878, Muhammad says, "The blood of a Muslim cannot be shed except in 3 cases: in response to murder, a married person who commits illegal sexual intercourse, and the one who reverts from Islam and leaves the Muslims." So that's 3 cases there: murder, adultery and apostasy. But there's also a 4th category that has been used to justify the death penalty for a range of other acts, including homosexuality, blasphemy, theft and idolatry. Surah 5 verse 33 says, "The punishment of those who wage war against Allah and his messenger and strive to make mischief in the land is only this, that they should be murdered or crucified, or their hands and their feet should be cut off on opposite sides, or they should be imprisoned. This shall be a disgrace for them in this world, and in the hereafter they shall have a grievous chastisement." So here the death penalty is allowed for those who wage war against Allah or make mischief in the land. Now what does making mischief mean? Well, the Muslim sources describe it for us. In the commentary by Ibn Kathir he writes, "And when it is said to them, do not make mischief in the land on the earth, it means do not commit acts of disobedience on the earth. Their mischief is just disobeying Allah, because whoever disobeys Allah on the earth or commands that Allah be disobeyed, he has committed mischief on the earth." And in Tafsir al-Jalalain it says that whoever slays a soul for other than a soul slain, or for other than corruption committed in the land, in the way of unbelief, fornication, or waylaying and the like, it shall be as if he had slain mankind altogether. So here we see mischief is described very broadly to include anything from unbelief to disobedience, and this lack of clarity feels very dangerous to me, because many modern Western Muslims would probably argue for a far more narrow view of mischief, and would perhaps only include people who are behaving in such a way that they directly threaten the lives of others. But the problem is, because the Quran isn't clear about it, the death penalty can be justified for all kinds of mischief, and has been throughout Islamic history. A recent example, in 2014, a fatwa was proclaimed on the mainstream website onislam.net that stated, "The punishment for men and women who are unwilling to give up homosexuality and therefore are rejecting the guidance of Allah Most High is in fact death, according to Islam." And there are verses in the Quran and Hadith to support this too. In Surah 26 verses 165 to 166 it says, "Of all the creatures in the world, will ye approach males and leave those whom Allah has created for you to be your mates? Nay, ye are a people transgressing." And in Sahih Bukhari 5886, Muhammad cursed effeminate men that assume the manners of women, and women who assume the manners of men. And in Sunan Abu Dawud 4462, Muhammad said, "Whoever you find doing the action of the people of Lut, execute the one who does it, and the one to whom it is done." So this shows a clear condemnation of homosexuality. Basically, the Quran commands the death penalty for murder, adultery and apostasy, but it also leaves the door open to a whole range of other actions that could be considered worthy of death too. So, the moral objections we've looked at so far are the lack of unconditional love, apostasy, enmity towards unbelievers, the death penalty, and homosexuality. And I'd like to look at 2 more areas because I think this is all really important. Firstly, the Quran has a very low view of women. Surah 2 verse 2:23 says, "Your wives are as a tilth unto you, so approach your tilth when and how ye will." So here men are told to view their wives as a field to be cultivated and ploughed. And in Surah 2 verse 282 it states that the testimony of a woman counts for half that of a man. It says, "And bring to witness 2 witnesses from among your men, and if there are not 2 men available, then a man and 2 women from those whom you accept as witnesses, so that if one of the women errs, then the other can remind her." And in Sahih Bukhari 2658, Muhammad explains why this is. Talking to a group of women, he said, "Isn't the witness of a woman equal to half of that of a man?" The women said, "Yes." He said, "This is because of the deficiency of a woman's mind." And there's more detail of this exchange found in Sahih Bukhari 304, where Muhammad says, "O women, give alms, as I have seen that the majority of the dwellers of hellfire were women." They asked, "Why is it so, O Allah's messenger?" He replied, "You curse frequently and are ungrateful to your husbands. I have not seen anyone more deficient in intelligence and religion than you. A cautious, sensible man could be led astray by some of you." So women are seen as deficient and like fields to be ploughed. Also, men are allowed to beat their wives. In Surah 4 verses 34, it says, "Men are in charge of women by right of what Allah has given one over the other, and what they spend for maintenance from their wealth. So righteous women are devoutly obedient, guarding in the husband's absence what Allah would have them guard. But those wives from whom you fear arrogance, first advise them, then if they persist, forsake them in bed, and finally strike them. But if they obey you once more, seek no means against them." So men are allowed to strike their wives. And there are many hadiths that attest to this, such as Sahih Muslim Book 4 number 2127, where Muhammad's wife Aisha describes how he struck her on the chest, which caused her pain. And on the topic of Aisha, she was one of Muhammad's many wives. And in Sahih Bukhari 5133 it states that the Prophet married her when she was 6 years old, and he consummated his marriage when she was 9 years old. Now this is confirmed in numerous other hadiths, such as Sunan Abi Dawud 2121, Sunan Ibn Majah Book 9 Hadith 1950, Sunan An-Nasai 3379 and 3255, and many other sources too. And it serves to illustrate another detestable moral endorsement in the Quran, that men are allowed to have sex with prepubescent girls. In Surah 65 verse 4 it talks about the waiting period a man must observe when contemplating divorcing a wife that he has had intercourse with. It says, "And those who no longer expect menstruation among your women, if you doubt, then their period is 3 months, and also for those who have not yet menstruated. And for those who are pregnant, their term is until they give birth." And an explanation of this verse is given in Al-Maududi's commentary, Tafhim al-Quran, where he writes, "Here one should bear in mind the fact that according to the explanations given in the Quran, the question of the waiting period arises in respect of the women with whom marriage may have been consummated, for there is no waiting period in case divorce is pronounced before the consummation of marriage. Therefore, making mention of the waiting period for the girls who have not yet menstruated clearly proves that it is not only permissible to give away the girl in marriage at this age, but it's also permissible for the husband to consummate marriage with her. This is girls who have not yet menstruated, young girls. Now obviously no Muslim has the right to forbid a thing which the Quran has held permissible." And that final line I find particularly chilling. So women are seen as a tilth to be ploughed, they're deficient in knowledge, men are allowed to beat them, and men are also allowed to marry and have sex with prepubescent girls. There are many other things I could have mentioned too, such as how men are allowed to have sex with their slave girls, even if their slave girls are married, and a woman is only entitled to half the inheritance of a man. Also, a man is allowed to marry up to 4 wives, but a woman is not equally allowed multiple husbands. So the Quran's view of women is pretty terrible, and this is a really big problem, and it's still a problem even in today's world. But the final area of moral objection I wanted to look at is the concept of Taqiyya, which means sacred deception. According to the Quran, sometimes it's okay to lie if the ends justify the means. It's put best in Reliance of the Traveller, which is the classic most authoritative book on Sharia law in Islam. On page 745, section R 8.2, it reads, "Speaking is a means to achieve objectives. If a praiseworthy aim is attainable through both telling the truth and lying, it is unlawful to accomplish through lying, because there is no need for it. When it is possible to achieve such an aim by lying but not telling the truth, it is permissible to lie if attaining the goal is permissible, and obligatory to lie if the goal is obligatory. It is religiously precautionary in all cases to employ words that give a misleading impression." And this is based on several passages from the Quran where deceit is allowed, such as Surah 2 verse 225, Surah 3 verse 28, Surah 9 verse 3, Surah 16 verse 106, and Surah 40 verse 28. It's also worth noting that Allah himself several times in the Quran is described as a deceiver. In Surah 3 verse 54, Surah 7 verse 99, Surah 8 verse 30, Surah 10 verse 21, and Surah 13 verse 42. Now, most translations will use words such as plotting and planning. Allah is the best of planners, it will say, but the root word used is makr, and according to Lane's lexicon, the word literally means to practice deceit or guile or circumvention, to practice evasion or illusion, to plot, to exercise art or craft or cunning, act with policy, or practice stratagem. And if you just put the Arabic word makr in Google Translate, it tells you that the word means cunning, wiliness, deceit, guile, deception, craftiness, slyness, artfulness, trick, craft, foxiness, roguery, calculating, and you get the idea. So this is the word that Allah is apparently the greatest example of. And the fact that the word gets translated as planning instead of deceiving is arguably a case in point. I think the most honest translation of the word makr is clearly something more like cunning, wily, or deceitful. And I think to translate the word as plotting or planning, I'd say is pretty misleading and deceitful itself. But that's 7 areas of moral objections I've looked at now where I believe the Quran does not align with reality, with what is good and right. The lack of unconditional love, the castigation of apostates, hostility towards unbelievers, the death penalty that's dished out far too readily, the condemnation of homosexuality, the discrimination of women, and the approval of sacred deception. So my conclusion is that the Quran does not align with my moral sense of reality and of what is good and what ought to be. So that's morally and historically the Quran has failed to align with reality. Let's see if it aligns scientifically. Well, we went through some of the scientific claims earlier, such as the embryological sequence, the shape of the Earth, the reflective light of the moon, iron sent from meteorites, and sweet and salt water not mixing. And what I argued with most of these cases is that they did not require supernatural knowledge to know these things in the 7th century. All of these facts were already commonly known at the time. But to the Quran's credit, most of these scientific claims were kind of true, apart from a few such as the claim that the bones form before the flesh in the embryological sequence, and I provided evidence to show that this was false. There's also the flat earth verses too, of course, which technically, if you just take the Quran, the words for flat are usually translated as spread out, and you can kind of just about get away with it, because you can just argue it's a more poetic description of the earth rather than literal. But if you actually looked into the surrounding Muslim sources, the consensus seems to be that the Quran does in fact teach that the earth is flat. In the Tafsir of Jalalain, I have pronounced that right, Tafsir of Jalalain, commenting about Surah 88 verse 20 that uses the word sutihat to describe the earth, he writes, "As for his words sutihat, laid out flat, this on a literal reading suggests that the earth is flat, which is the opinion of most of the scholars of the revealed law, and not a sphere as astronomers have it." So in the Tafsir of Jalalain, one of the most famous and respected commentaries of the Quran, it said that most of the Islamic scholars agree that the Quran teaches that the earth is flat. So I'd say that's a pretty big error there. But let's look at some other scientific errors in the Quran. Continuing on with the cosmological theme, another error is that the Quran seems to view the earth as the centre of the universe, which the sun orbits around. Surah 36 verse 40 reads, "It is not allowable for the sun to reach the moon, nor does the night overtake the day, but each in an orbit is swimming." So here Muhammad seems to believe that the sun is in an orbit around the earth, which is clearly wrong. Now some Muslims claim that technically the sun is in an orbit, only it's the centre of the Milky Way that the sun is orbiting around. But there are three problems with this. Firstly, that's not how a common sense view of the verse reads. Secondly, just a couple of sentences before this verse, it says that the sun runs on course towards its stopping point. But does the sun ever stop as it's orbiting around the Milky Way? No, it's continuously moving. And thirdly, Muhammad actually illuminates the problem in the hadith. In Sahih Muslim 159a, it says, "The Messenger of Allah one day said, 'Do you know where the sun goes?' They replied, 'Allah and his apostle knows best.' He observed, 'Verily, it glides till it reaches its resting place under the throne. Then it falls prostrate and remains there until it is asked, Rise up and go to the place whence you came, and it goes back and continues emerging out from its rising place, and then glides till it reaches its place of rest under the throne and falls prostrate, and remains in that state until it is asked, Rise up and return to the place whence you came, and it returns and emerges out from its rising place, and then it glides,' and on and on." So Muhammad obviously thought that the sun did a lot of moving. It glides across the sky, then it goes down to its resting place and stops and waits there till it's called back up again, and it repeats this cycle. Now Muhammad is obviously describing his view of the daily cycle of the sun. He's not describing the orbit around the Milky Way, because that takes 250 million years. And if Muhammad had known the truth, he would have said that the sun goes nowhere. It is the earth that travels around the sun. But he very clearly thinks it's the other way round. So this is an error. Another error is found in Surah 68 verse 1, which reads, "Nun, by the pen and what they inscribed." Now, that may seem fairly mysterious and innocuous at first, but according to Ibn Abbas, who was a companion of Muhammad, in his commentary he writes, regarding the interpretation of Allah saying Nun, he says Allah swears by the Nun, which is the whale that carries the earths on its back while in water, and beneath which is the bull, and under the bull is the rock, and under the rock is the dust, and none knows what is under the dust save Allah. So this is from one of the earliest and most famous commentaries of the Quran on the authority of a man who was a companion of Muhammad himself. So that's pretty crazy. Also, you may have noticed it said earths multiple. This is also from the Quran. In Surah 65 verse 12 it says, "It is Allah who created 7 heavens and of the earth the like of them." So Muhammad seems to think there are 7 heavens and 7 earths. Well, Muslims often explain this by saying that actually modern science tells us that there are 7 layers of atmosphere and 7 layers of earth, and it's this that Muhammad is referring to. But the problem with this is that there are generally considered to be 5 core layers of atmosphere: the exosphere, the thermosphere, the mesosphere, the stratosphere, and the troposphere, and also 5 core layers of the earth too: the crust, the upper mantle, the lower mantle, the outer core, and the inner core. And the second problem is that once again the Muslim sources enlighten us to exactly what Muhammad meant. In Jami at-Tirmidhi, I'm not pronouncing these right, in Jami at-Tirmidhi, another of the major hadith collections, in book 47 number 3611, it says, "Then he, Muhammad, said, 'Do you know what is under you?' They said, 'Allah and his messenger know better.' He said, 'Indeed it is the earth.' Then he said, 'Do you know what is under that?' They said, 'Allah and his messenger know better.' He said, 'Verily below it is another earth, between the two of which is a distance of 500 years, until he enumerated 7 earths. Between every 2 earths is a distance of 500 years. Then he said, by the one in whose hand is the soul of Muhammad, if you were to send a man down with a rope to the lowest earth, then he would descend upon Allah. So here we see it clearly stated that Muhammad not only believed that there were 7 earths, but he also believed that they were stacked one on top of each other, with a distance of 500 years between them. So needless to say, this is another error. Let's look at a couple more. Surah 67 verse 5 says, and verily we have beautified the world's heaven with lamps, and we have made them missiles for the devils, and for them we have prepared the doom of flame. So here the Quran teaches that the stars are used as missiles to drive away demons, which is pretty crazy. Now, some Muslims try to translate this passage a little differently, and they'll say that the missiles are made from the stars, or from part of the stars. And some even translate it to mean that the stars are conjectures for the devils. But once again, we find clarification in the Hadith. In Surah Sahih Bukhari 3198, it says, Abu Qatada, mentioning Allah's saying, and indeed we have adorned the nearest heaven with lamps, said, the creation of these stars is for 3 purposes, and they are 1. As decoration of the nearest heaven, 2. As missiles to hit the devils, and 3. As signs to guide travellers. So if anybody tries to find a different interpretation, he is mistaken and just wastes his effort and troubles himself with what is beyond his limited knowledge. So this is coming from the Muslims' own most authentic and trusted sources, written just a generation or 2 after Muhammad. Now other Muslims might say, well, how do you know that the stars aren't missiles that shoot the demons? Maybe in the spiritual realm this is what's happening. Well, firstly, I can't really argue with that logic other than to say that it sounds a lot like the way the ancient Greeks used to believe that lightning was a weapon of Zeus. But secondly, the other problem is that shooting stars are not actually stars. They're pieces of rock that hit our atmosphere. So this part of the passage is in error as well. Let's look at one more. And this one's a biological one. Surah 86 verses 5 to 7 say, so let man observe from what he has created. He was created from a fluid ejected emerging from between the backbone and the ribs. So here the Quran seems to claim that semen originates between the backbone and the ribs, but this is wrong. Semen is generated in the testicles. Now some translations say between the loins and the ribs, which feels a little closer but is still a fair distance out. Some apologists claim that the fluid ejected refers to blood that is pumped from the aorta to provide the testicles with the necessary nutrients. But firstly, this doesn't make sense. The verse says he was created from a fluid ejected. The fluid that man is created from is not blood. The verse is obviously referring to semen, and in Tafsir Ibn Abbas it's explained that the fluid is ejected into the womb of a woman. So the fluid can't be blood, it clearly means semen. Another claim is that when a male is still a fetus in his mother's womb, his testicles actually form higher up inside his body and then begin to lower as the baby grows until they descend between the legs when he's born. And so technically your testicles do begin life between the backbone and the ribs. But firstly, that's wrong. The testicles in a fetus are never higher than just below the kidneys, which you can ascertain by searching the term cryptocadism. And secondly, that's not how the passage reads at all. The passage doesn't say he was created from a fluid ejected emerging from between the backbone and the ribs several decades ago when you were still a fetus, but now it emerges from the testicles. The common sense reading of the passage is that Muhammad thought that semen originated somewhere in the middle of the body, but he is in error. It originates in the testicles. So that will do. There are plenty more errors I could have mentioned, such as the teaching that all living things are created in pairs, which is wrong because some life forms are asexual, or the belief that human beings were created from clay, which is false and is just a borrowing from a common ancient belief. Not to mention all the errors found in the Hadith, such as Muhammad's command that if you find a fly in your drink, dip it back in because one wing contains a disease but the other wing contains the cure. Or Muhammad's advice to his followers to drink camel's urine as a medicine when they became sick. but hopefully this is enough to show you that the Quran does not align with scientific reality. And so that's it. I've been through all the supernatural criteria, scientific foreknowledge, prophecy, mathematical codes, and the argument from the perfection of the Quran itself, and I've hopefully given you more than enough evidence to see that there's nothing supernatural about this book. I then went through all the natural criteria to see if the book aligns with reality, but found many historical, scientific and moral errors throughout the Quran, which further damages the case that this is the word of God. And my conclusion is that this book was written by a human being called Muhammad, probably a very intelligent, exceptional and progressive human being, but a human nonetheless.